Νικόλα, νομίζω να αρχίσουμε.
Οκ, να αρχίσουμε. Εντάξει, θα κάνω τον πρόλογο και ύστερα να μπούμε στην ομιλία.
Ναι, ναι.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's very good to have you this evening. It's very gratifying to see such an impressive turnout for the final talk in our series, our autumn and winter series of talks, jointly sponsored by the Open University of Cyprus, the Center for Cultural Heritage and Environmental Heritage, and the Cyprus Research Center. Our guest speaker this evening is Professor Tassos Papacostas, who teaches in the Department of Classics at King's College, University of London, and is responsible, he specializes in the teaching of Byzantine material culture. Despite this specialization, I should point out that Professor Tassos has given talks well beyond the Byzantine period, covering various aspects of Lusignan and Venetian Cyprus, and indeed this talk this evening is devoted to the study of Venetian heraldry on the island. So, Tassos, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Nikos, for a very kind and introduction. Let me see if I'm sharing correctly my screen. I guess you can see full screen now, my presentation, right?
Yes, yes.
Okay, thanks a lot. Well, apologies for doing this in English rather than Greek, but it's both because it's my working language and in order to reach a wider audience, hopefully. So there we go. Now, the use of a few introductory words, first of all. I should have thanked, of course, Sophocles and Nikos for the invitation to present here in this series. Very grateful. Okay, so the use of heraldic symbols, armorial bearings, or coat of arms is obviously a Western European, well, it is of Western European origin, a Western European practice elaborated primarily from the sort of Crusader period onwards, let's say 12th century onwards. It reached Cyprus together with various other Western practices and artistic cultural imports at the time of the Lusignan kingdom, so very roughly 13th, 15th century, and flourished into the 16th century during the time of Venetian rule. Heraldry in Cyprus, coats of arms, are to be seen primarily in funerary monuments, tomb slabs, tombstones, primarily, mainly in Nicosia and Famagusta. There is very roughly around 200 examples in that sort of context, funerary context. And then the remainder, about 100, again, very roughly, specimens on building facades, but also on portable objects, on icons, on reliefs, on frescoes as well, not portable, but they are there. Now, how does one identify a coat of arms? Well, the easy way is when you have an inscription with a name accompanying the coat of arms, and you can tell the name of the person, the family, and hopefully a date as well. This is often the case with funerary slabs and with some painted examples, whether on panels or in fresco. In completely anonymous cases, as we shall see, what is very helpful is the evidence from Italy, especially during the later period, the sort of 15th, 16th centuries, when it was very common to compile compendia, sort of collections, lists of coats of arms belonging to different families for different cities. And in the case of Venetians in Cyprus, this does prove quite useful. At this point, I should also make a distinction between the relatively little known local Cypriot families and their coat of arms, and those belonging to Venetians or other Italians whose heraldry is much better known, much better documented. Today I'll be showing you primarily examples from the latter category. So primarily Venetians who were serving or lived or passed through Cyprus. I'll be talking about 5 examples, 5 sort of case studies. Let me Yes, here we are. 5 case studies in order to illustrate the various facets of heraldry, how it can be used, how it can be useful, in fact, beyond the mere identification of the arms, as a tool for the cultural historian, primarily, which is indeed how I came to all of this, looking at buildings. So here we are in Famagusta. We've got, okay. We'll be going to Famagusta and then to Nicosia. So the two main cities of Cyprus in the late medieval and early modern period. So here we are at the heart of Famagusta. Let me indicate the main buildings. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but you have the arrows. There is the great cathedral, of course, in the middle, in the center, St. Nicholas. And then to its right, behind the trees, the Loggia Bembo. Opposite, on the other side of the square, the site of the old royal palace, and in the Venetian period, the sort of seat of the Capitano of Famagusta. This was the most important military figure in Venetian Cyprus. So he was the sort of military commander of Famagusta and of the whole of Cyprus, in fact. Note the twin Venetian columns barely visible in front of the domed building on the left of St. Nicholas, and the domed building itself. So I will be commenting on most of these structures. So let's start my first case study. We'll start with the building at the bottom of the image, the Palazzo del Capitano, the sort of seat of the Capitano. Here it is, well known because of its all'antica facade. So this sort of half-rinsed facade, which clearly is inspired from classical models. Its architectural vocabulary is classically inspired. It was erected during the Venetian period. Note that in the middle of the central arch, on the keystone, there is the coat of arms, which you see in an enlarged image, bottom right. This is easily identifiable, even though there is no inscription or anything else here. It is easily available through comparison, it has been identified it was identified a long time ago. It belongs to the family of Renier, a Venetian family. So we can safely assume this belongs to a Venetian official from that family. And indeed, it's quite easy to figure out who this is. The Capitano Giovanni Renier, who served in the early 50s. These officials were sent to Cyprus for 2 years, usually, and then they would go back and someone else would replace them. Now, why is this important? Well, the identification of the Capitano through his arms allows us to get a specific date for this important all'antica Renaissance structure in Famagusta in order to assess the importation, the adaptation, the sort of dissemination of such architectural ideas, this type of architecture on the island. So this is a very straightforward case. It allows us to date this facade. And note also the ancient columns. These are spolia columns, meaning they are reused columns, probably from nearby Salamis Constantia, quite common practice in this period. And indeed, the Capitano Renier, we know that he was very much interested in antiquity. He was instrumental in the dispatch of the famous sarcophagus of the Amazons found at Soli, and it was sent to Venice. It ended up in Vienna, where it is to be seen still today. So that's the first very straightforward case, which gives us a date for this facade, and then architectural historians can discuss further what does it all mean. If we move opposite, on the other side of the square, to the dome building I indicated earlier, which is sort of next to the twin columns we see on the right of the image, and note that, of course, these are also spolia columns erected in the 16th century on the square in Famagusta. This is a very intriguing structure. Unlike the facade we've just seen, this has not been studied very much, has not been written about much. It is usually identified as an Ottoman medrese, although Bayish Khan, our Turkish Cypriot colleague, who wrote a few years ago a sort of catalog, a corpus of buildings from the Ottoman period on Cyprus, suspected quite rightly that there might be earlier elements within this structure. So what we have is a square domed hall on the left here. Note the 3 windows with marble frames. Again, these must be reused marble elements. And then on the right, between the dome structure and the twin columns, there is this sort of portico that runs on the west facade of the building and continues in an L-shaped towards the south, on the south facade, facing the cathedral. This seems to be a later addition, I think. Now, inside, if you walk through the door of what is nowadays a restaurant, in fact, up the stairs into the building, you have 3 more windows on the inner facade corresponding to the 3 we see here on the outside. And what's interesting there is that 2 of them bear 1 inscription and 1 coat of arms from different periods, from different contexts, it seems. Now, let's start with the armorial lintel. This is the central window of that inner western facade. For some obscure reason, this has never been commented upon or identified, although it's always been visible, at least in recent sort of decades, centuries. We've got a medallion with an armorial shield flanked by 2 initial letters, I-Z, and underneath a date, a year, 1514. So such initials flanking armorial shields usually indicate the name of the person represented here. The first letter representing the baptismal or the first name, the second one, the family name. So in conjunction with the date, we can easily identify this as the arms, the coat of arms of another Capitano of Famagusta, Juan Ioannes Zantani. And these are indeed the Zantani arms. Again, I've put for a manuscript, contemporary 16th century manuscript, a depiction of the Zantani arms. Now, here we don't have the colors to confirm, unlike the Renier arms, where we did have tinctures. Tincture is the technical term used in heraldry for the colors on a shield, the colors of the charges. But I don't think there's any doubt about the Zantani case here. I'm not sure whether this shield, this medallion, were ever properly painted, or whether the brownish color we see there dates from some later period. Is not entirely certain. It is not certain also what is going on here. Now, do we assume, because of this, that the entire structure, this domed square hall, was erected under Zantani in 1514, which is indeed, by the way, the year he was appointed to his office in Cyprus? We have this through external textual evidence. So did he actually build this? Is this a Venetian period, early 16th century structure? Is it an even earlier structure, which Zantani restored and placed his coats of arms here, perhaps even carving them, having them carved, the arms, on an already existing lintel, marble lintel, which was already here in this position? Or is this element, the entire marble lintel with the coat of arms, a spolium reused in the Ottoman period and placed here when the madrasa was erected? Not clear. I mean, all 3 options are sort of plausible, I think. Now, if we look at the other lintel to the left of this one, hoping for clarification, I'm afraid this gets even more complicated. So this is to the left, the window towards the outer facade. Note the different marble. We have a Syriac inscription starting on the top right where the cross is. It is in Estrangelo. It commemorates the construction of a Jacobite church of Marbechnam in Famagusta. The end of the inscription is on the left-hand side, behind the wall, what I think is the later wall, the wall of the portico attached to this building. So it would be quite easy, actually, to remove a few stones from this later wall and see and get the end of the inscription where the date is, in fact, in the sequence of the inscription. So a Syriac inscription, Jacobite church. When does this inscription date from? Not clear. What on earth is it doing here? Even less clear. Is it another spolium? If both this and the armorial lintel are spolia, it's a bit odd because they are placed correctly. They are not upside down. They are not inside out. You know, the arms of the Capitano are in the central opening. This one is on the side, but whoever placed it here realized that this is the way it should be read. So it was placed there correctly. So again, there's no, I don't have a solution to this. What one should do is investigate further the building itself, the other marble elements. The southern door does preserve some moldings which may prove sort of significant in the dating. So in this case, we have a coat of arms that may help us disentangle the complex history of this structure. Let me move on to the next slide if I manage. Okay, so if we assume that this domed structure shown in red on the plan here of the square dates from the time of Capitano Zantani, beginning of the 16th century, it would be significant on a number of accounts. If you note on this plan of the square in Famagusta, there are several structures erected, restored, placed there in the middle of the 16th century. There is the Loggia Bembo to the south, number 4. There is the octagonal fountain, which used to stand in the middle of the square, number 1. The twin columns, number 2, with the sarcophagus of Venus in between the two, as shown in the 18th century engraving top right. There's the Renier facade we saw earlier, number 3. So a lot of activity, a lot of stuff happening on the square in the 1450s, 40s and 50s. This is the time when the Venetian authorities took an interest in the urban landscape of Famagusta and erected, successive capitani erected all these structures. If we have an additional, much earlier building by Zantani in 1514, it would suggest an early interest in the urban development of Famagusta and in this sort of progressive effort of turning it into a properly Venetian city, at least the heart of the city, the center of the city. Okay, so that's the significance of this particular case study. Now, in both of these, the ones we've seen so far, the two capitani, Zantani and Renier, note, first of all, that they display their arms on public buildings in fairly prominent positions in relief. Why is this important? Well, because they were not supposed to do this. This was not allowed. It was prohibited. This was part of sumptuary laws in order to prevent extravagance, luxury, self-promotion, and there were laws sort of regarding dress, entertainment, banqueting, all sorts of things in this period throughout the Venetian possessions and in Venice itself, and of course elsewhere in Italy. Indeed, in 1479, the Senate in Venice noted that the desire of officials throughout Venetian territory, both on the terraferma in Italy and in the Stato da Mar in the overseas territories, their desire to attach their name to buildings was so great in order to sort of show how much they cared about the place where they were posted, that they in fact initiated building projects which were completely unnecessary, just to place their arms on them and be able to tell everybody, I did this. So the Venetian authorities took measures. At that point, 1479, the Senate ruled that only simple arms could be displayed in paint or sculpture on one single building by each official. So by that account, these are fine, the ones we've got on our screen. They're fairly simple and not huge in size. But then in 1489, which is well before our two examples, and it is indeed the very year Cyprus came officially under Venetian rule, 1489, the Council of Ten in Venice passed another law, a new law, a stricter one, allowing only painted arms and only inside the local residence of the official in question, which is clearly not the case in either of these, the Zantani and the Renier. So they were obviously going against the regulations by doing this. And indeed, for Famagusta itself, we have specific evidence for this prohibition from the commissions. These are the contracts that officials were issued with upon their appointments. Before departing Venice, they were given a document by the Venetian government stating the regulations, what they're supposed to do when they get to their place where they were posted. And there are two examples from Famagusta, 4 capitani of the city, which explicitly state that no arms are to be displayed on buildings erected or restored by the capitani of Famagusta, except from the palace. So maybe that's the Renier facade, that building, but then only in paint, not the way Renier did it in relief on the facade. The text says ex pictura sola. There are several other examples surviving on Cyprus and elsewhere in Venetian territories, clearly indicating that all these officials really didn't care about legislation. And I'll show you just one example from elsewhere, not Cyprus. This is the very grand land gate at Zadar, where you see the two heraldic shields at the top tier of this facade of the gate, flanking the Lion of St. Mark, very prominently displayed, very large in scale. So this is just one example among many, many. It wasn't only the officials in Cyprus doing this. My third example, still in Famagusta. We are moving to the land gate of the city. So note in the background, St. Nicholas. Now we are at the entrance, the one and only entrance into the city until the 19th, early 20th century, when more openings were pierced through the walls. So this is the land gate, the Limassol gate, with the ravelin in front of it, this defensive structure. Originally, one would enter the ravelin and the city itself through its side, as shown on the plan by George Jeffrey. Left and right, you have drawbridges. The one we see today is a much more recent construction. So you go through the ravelin, enter the tower behind, and exit on the other side in the city. Now, in that space, on the other side, towards the city, there is one example, one case that may indicate that at least some officials did abide by the rules. Here we are on the inside, this vaulted entrance into the structure itself. So you go through and you end up outside the city on the other side. So the recent restoration of this conserved these two painted panels that flank the archway. here. I mean, they are very damaged, very sort of difficult to decipher, to read. The colors are very faded, but very usefully, George Jeffrey in the early 20th century made drawings of them. Here is the drawing on top. The middle one, ignore it. That's the Renier arms that we had on the Palazzo facade, on the square. So left and right, we have drawings by Jeffrey of the two painted arms here under this vault. The ones on the left with the round shapes, the bezants, as they would be called, were identified a long time ago, fairly securely, as the arms of the Michiel family, another Venetian family. Those on the right were not identified until recently, after the restoration, when this panel was placed next to the entrance. And as you see, the suggestion here is that the arms belong to the Spinola. Now, the Spinola were Genoese, not Venetian. And indeed, several members of that family served on Cyprus as Genoese officials during the Genoese occupation of Famagusta from the 1370s to the 1460s, when the city was under Genoa. And also several Spinola merchants and others were passing through Cyprus or lived there. So they were present on the island, but I think it's very unlikely that the arms on the gate, opposite those of a Venetian official, a Michiel, belong to a Genoese Spinola. And indeed, if one looks more carefully at the painted panel, I mean, I'm afraid you cannot see this on my photograph, but if you, well, next time you're in Famagusta, have a closer look. You will see that the colors are different. They are not, I will not use heraldic terminology just to make things simpler. The Spinola are red and white in the central checkered elements. This is not what we have in the painted panel. What we have is blue and yellow, in fact, and these are the arms of the Gabriel, or Gabriel with a C, another Venetian family. So if we are looking for officials to whom we could attach these, I would suggest a Gabriel and a Michiel who coincided in Famagusta at some point in the 1560s. A Capitano, Niccolò Gabriel, and the Proveditore. The Proveditore was a sort of supreme military commander sent to the overseas territories at times of threats, of war, of... so he wasn't an official permanently based on Cyprus. He would be sent there or to Crete or to any other place during times of trouble. So maybe these are the two, but this requires further confirmation. I haven't been able to find text evidence of these two men, these two officials, doing anything in particular at the land gate here in Famagusta. But the gate, in fact, was, well, constant work in progress. There were additions and alterations being done throughout the decades of Venetian rule. So what this suggests is that at least some officials respected the legislation about painted arms. I wonder if this is at the instigation of the Proveditore, a very, very high-ranking official who arrived here and did not want to flout the rules and force the Capitano to do the same. Of course, these are under the archway. They are very well, they are not very well preserved. They are preserved. I wonder if there were not more painted arms on facades, as suggested by the legislation, which have disappeared because they are exposed to weather conditions. Now, let's move elsewhere to my fourth example case study in Nicosia, the well-known Famagusta Gate, where we see again an example of officials not respecting that legislation about displaying their arms. This is the inner facade of the gate, of course, towards the city, not towards the outside. What this is interesting for, as an example, is the hierarchical display of more or less the entire Venetian administration of Cyprus. That's what it is sort of, that's what it illustrates, because on top, flanking the central gateway, on top we have the arms, the coat of arms of the Luogotenente, Niccolò Dandolo, and on the other side, the Proveditore Francesco Barbaro. Now, the Luogotenente was the governor, the most high-ranking Venetian official on the island, residing in Nicosia, unlike the Capitano who was in Famagusta. And he was assisted by his two consiglieri. There were always just two of them. Their arms are displayed on the two external lateral sides of the gate. So Benedetto Mula and Niccolò Loredan. Underneath the central parts, we have the Capitano Marcantonio Bragadin, the well-known, the famous Bragadin, who was martyred at the siege of Famagusta, and the mysterious Chivran arms. Now, I say mysterious because the rest of the coat of arms represent everybody you would expect to find here. Luogotenente, consiglieri, proveditore, capitano. There's nobody else to represent Chivran. So what sort of official was this Chivran? I have no idea, to be honest. And I tried hard to look at all the sources of the period in order to see if there was a Chivran official posted at that time on the eve of the Ottoman conquest in Nicosia. No success. If anyone knows something I don't, please do tell me. So that's one aspect, the hierarchical display, and this question it throws up with the Chivran arms. Again, quite common to show, display coat of arms of officials in a group like this, representing the entire administration of a province, of a Venetian province, in the proper order, according to their rank. This is not random. And again, I can show you a couple of other examples. Here, that there is an example from Treviso, not far from Venice, another example from Zara in Dalmatia with the Lion of St. Mark, and one of the gates of Verona at the bottom, again with several armorial shields. Now, one thing to note here is the support, the material used for these coats of arms. I'm looking at several of them, both those in Famagusta and here in Nicosia. I've been wondering what stone, what type of stone is this? I mean, it could very well be the local gypsum called marmara on Cyprus, and used very often for, especially for flax weaving, sort of white. It becomes quite shiny when it's polished, but I understand it's not particularly good for carving. Again, this is something I need help with, and if someone here knows more about marmara stone and what one can do and not do with it, I'd be very grateful to hear. Anyway, it's some kind of white stone. Note the contrast with the local stone of Nicosia that we see in the two examples on the right from the Famagusta gate, which in a way reflects the same idea we see in Venice very often, where white Istrian stone is commonly used for such elements. That contrasts quite nicely with the red brick. I mean, we see this in a way at Treviso, top left, with the white stone there and the red brick. I'm noting this because I have some suspicion that some of these Cypriot coat of arms may have been carved out of Istrian stone, imported Istrian stone. Now, how would this work? Well, blocks could have been imported and carved locally on Cyprus, or these panels could have been carved in Venice and sent just ready to be installed on a building. Now, let me explain what Istrian stone is. Well, first of all, that's where it peninsula of Istria, obviously, opposite Venice. It was easily shipped across the Gulf of Venice into the city. It starts being extensively used in the course of the 14th century, primarily for window frames, door frames, decorative elements, as we see on this, on Kafoskari from the middle of the 15th century. And later on, by the end of the 15th, 16th century, it is used to revet entire facades, like San Giorgio Maggiore, we see on the left. And in Venice itself, as Canaletto's much later painting shows, large chunks, blocks of this Eastern stone were imported and were carved locally in the city. I don't know whether this happened with Cyprus as well, whether such chunks could have been sent over and carved locally. It would, of course, have been much easier to do the carving and have much smaller elements shipped to the island. Yes, is there, let me see, I'm getting lost in my notes here. Yes, if you think about the arms, we also saw in Famagusta, both the Renier panel on the Palazzo facade, but also what we have on the Loggia Bembo, which I haven't shown you. These are also made of some type of white stone. I also wonder what that might be. Okay, let me move to my last example that raises slightly different issues, although I shall be talking again about types of stone. So now we are in the ecclesiastical hub, the ecclesiastical center of Nicosia. I mean, the Famagusta Gate is somewhere towards the top of the picture over there. So we have the Latin cathedrals in Sofia, mostly 13th century. To the right, the much smaller Greek Cathedral of the Virgin or the Yttria, which was extensively refurbished, restored during the Venetian period in the 16th century. And on the other side of the Latin Cathedral, a complex of structures which used to house the Latin Archbishopric. So that's where the Latin Archbishop of Cyprus would reside, have offices. Well, the operations of the Latin ecclesiastical hierarchy would have been carried out of this complex, which dates primarily to the Ottoman period, what we have nowadays, but it does incorporate lots of older elements. So I'll be focusing on this complex of the Archbishopric. Here it is, an old photograph by Camille Enlard from the late 19th century, and the more recent one showing, I mean, there are several heraldic panels on this facade. I show the old photograph to indicate that these are, I don't think these have been moved from elsewhere. They are on this facade because this is where they were originally installed. And I will focus on the one you see on the right, which is next to the window up there on the upper floor. Now, this hasn't, I mean, a bit like some of the examples we saw earlier, was never identified. It clearly belongs to a prelate. There is the episcopal mitre on top of the heraldic shield, as you can see, so that indicates this is a bishop. And we also have the initials very helpfully underneath, ND. So we are looking for a bishop whose family name starts with a D and whose family bore this sort of heraldic device. Now, we know the sequence of archbishops of Nicosia in the course of the Venetian period in the 15th, 16th century, which seems to be the date of this based on style. None of them matches this. What it does match is the arms of the Dolce family, another Venetian family. And you see again two examples from manuscripts, top left, 16th century manuscripts. Dolce is the Venetian version in Venetian dialect of the name Dolce. it refers to the heraldic beast. And so this is clearly, I think, without any doubt, a bishop of Limassol, Niccolò Dolce, and you've got his dates there. Now, the issue here is what on earth are his arms doing on the building of the Nicosia prelate, the Archbishop of Nicosia. Well, we do know from the sources, first of all, that these bishops were never in Cyprus. They were appointed. They were Italians, Venetians, very often. Upon their appointment, they would remain in Italy. They would rarely, if ever, come to Cyprus. They would send instead representatives. And for the Bishop of Limassol in particular, we do know from textual evidence that these people were not in Limassol, which was a fairly insignificant place in the 16th century. They would reside in the center of power in Nicosia. What this panel suggests is that not only they were in Nicosia, but they operated perhaps from the same complex as the archbishops themselves. Again, the archbishops were not here either. They were in Venice most of the time. In fact, if we look further down on the same facade, there is another coat of arms. This one was identified a long time ago, the arms of Bishop Niccolò Donà, another bishop of Limassol, not of Nicosia. He later on became Patriarch of Aquileia, the most important ecclesiastical office in Venice, and his arms, top right, date from that time when he was Patriarch after being Bishop of Limassol. And you've got the sequence of bishops there to give you an idea. So we have at least two, and there are in fact more coats of arms on this facade. Why do we have several heraldic shields on the same facade? Not all of these people or the representatives built this structure or contributed to its refurbishment or anything like that. I think this functions purely as a display of the succession of bishops. And indeed, this is not uncommon to use building facades as a display for the succession of officials generally, not just religious figures, ecclesiastics. We have the very useful testimony of Giovanni Mariti. Now, Mariti was in Cyprus in the Ottoman period. He spent several years on the island in the 1760s, left us with a very detailed and good description of parts of the island. And he says for Famagusta, for the facade I showed you earlier, the Renier facade, he says that, and you've got the Italian original text on the screen, opposite the church, that is St. Nicholas, the Latin cathedral. On the square, there are three arches standing on various columns of oriental granite. These are indeed the spolia, the four spolia columns we see on the photograph, having in the middle the arms of the Republic of Venice. Now, I don't know whether at the time there was a lion of St. Mark or whether he's talking about the Renier arms. The important bit is the next one. The remainder of the wall, the rest of the wall, is all covered with the arms of Venetian families and Genoese families, at least that's what he identified them as, who had control over the city in the past. So what he's telling us is that this facade, they don't only bear the Renier arms in the center, the ones we see today, but there were lots of other coats of arms, perhaps both here and on the inner facade, in fact. This is very common. If you travel around Italy, look at public buildings from the late medieval, early modern period, such as this one in Padua, the Palazzo della Ragione. I mean, look at all these coats of arms representing mostly Venetian officials presiding over the city. So I think we should imagine both in the case of the Famagusta facade and the archbishopric facade in Nicosia, a similar elaborate display, perhaps not as many as here, but several coats of arms shown on these facades. Now, coming to the material for the Dolce arms. Now, this is clearly marble. It's not white stone, as we've seen in the other examples. And indeed, we do know from textual evidence that the ruins of Salamis Constantia during the Venetian period were well, not really excavated, but visited, and lots of marble elements taken away. Columns, capitals, carved elements, blocks of marble to be recarved. So this piece we have in Nicosia could have been carved out of an ancient spolium, an ancient piece of marble. Moreover, this is clearly Proconnesian marble. It's not any random marble. It's marble from Proconnesus. There was a lot of it in Salamis Constantia and in other ancient cities of Cyprus. And this is where this marble originated, from the Sea of Marmara near Constantinople, from the island of Proconnesus. Indeed, the Sea of Marmara takes its name from the marble quarried at Proconnesus. Now, I should explain that this was exported from Proconnesus, sent to Cyprus in late antiquity, so roughly 1,000 years before the Niccolò Dolce panel was carved. It was very common back then. Marble elements were exported from Proconnesus throughout the Eastern Mediterranean, at least for churches, for public buildings. This was the most important quarry, marble quarry in the late antique empire. Cyprus does not have in its soil this type of marble. So that's one option. Our panel was carved out of an ancient, well, old Proconnesian block taken from Salamis or some other ancient site and carved in Nicosia for the bishop. There is, however, an alternative suggestion. Yes, I should note, I'm showing this just to note how widespread the use of Proconnesian marble is in the Venetian period on Cyprus. There are several buildings, inscriptions like those of the Papacostas use such marble for panels, for all sorts of other things. What makes me suspicious a little bit about the Niccolò Dolce panel is well, first of all, the extremely skillful execution. I'm not saying that Cypriot craftsmen or craftsmen working on Cyprus, wherever they came from, would not be able to do this. But there is this aspect. This is much better quality. This is a very competent craftsman compared to most other comparable panels on the island from this period. And then notice the decorative pattern on the frame, the palmette and lotus motif. Now, this is very common in all'antica architecture, well, in the architecture of the 15th and 16th centuries, the arch painting, you find it, you see it everywhere. It's a very common classical motif that is sort of revived in this period. The examples on the left show printed examples which made their way to Cyprus, like the treatise of Serlio on architecture, or the Hypnerotomachia Polyphili. Not that there is clear evidence that it ever made its way to Cyprus, but illustrated, printed books like this could have been carried to Cyprus. And then the two examples at the bottom are Italian, but they are in Italy, just to show the widespread character of all this. So could this, in fact, our Dolce panel, have been carved in Venice, not in Cyprus, and sent over out of Proconnesian marble in Venice? Now, there is a lot of it. If you go around Venice, a lot of buildings use, again, obviously older pieces of Proconnesian marble. This detail from the facade of San Marco shows the revetments that you see behind the columns. These are slabs of Proconnesian marble, and some of the columns are made of it, carved out of it as well. Indeed, there is so much Proconnesian marble in Venice employed primarily in the 14th down to the 16th centuries that some scholars, at least one scholar, has suggested that the quarries on Proconnesus, which as far as we know were no longer being exploited after late antiquity, must have been reactivated in the late medieval period. But this is something that requires further research. So, to conclude on this panel and move to my last slide, I hope I haven't taken too much time. There are two options for this one. Either it was carved on Cyprus by a very skilled craftsman, trained possibly in Venice, or at least having a very good familiarity, very good acquaintance with what is going on in Venice, out of a block on Cyprus, a Proconnesian block on Cyprus, or it could have been carved in Venice out of Proconnesian marble there by a local craftsman and sent over to Cyprus in order to be installed on the facade by the representative of Bishop Niccolò Dolci. Okay, to conclude, I hope I haven't exhausted you. What all these panels tell us, what coat of arms can be used for? Well, they can refine the dating of important buildings, as we saw in the Renier case in Famagusta, and therefore allow those buildings within their wider context, architectural, culture, and all that. They help us identify the patron or the person who commissioned the building in some cases, and therefore, again, start assessing the input of this particular individual, especially in the case of Famagusta, in the context of the urban renewal and the refashioning of the main square of the city. They throw light on the Venetian administration, the hierarchy of that administration, and some problems. As we saw with the Chivran panel, there are other similar examples. They tell us something about the degree to which regulations, laws were flouted by the Venetian officials, and we've seen this in many other places. So Cyprus does not have the monopoly. The officials posted on the island are not the only ones doing it. They tell us, these coat of arms, about the activity of the representatives of Latin prelates who were sitting in Italy, enjoying their benefices and their income from their Cypriot sees, and getting their representatives to do things on the island and sort of display their presence, their interest in their seas. They tell us about carving techniques, traditions, materials being used, and indeed, I'm glad to say that there is a lot of work being done on this sort of thing nowadays by various colleagues and students on funerary slabs, on the style of carving, on the inscriptions, on the heraldry, on all sorts of things. Note also the multiplicity of styles. I mean, we are in a fairly small place, Cyprus, and yet there's a lot of variety, which suggests a lot of demand for such carvings and more than one single workshop responding to this demand. What you see on the screen, all these images represent material I have not mentioned and discussed, material I haven't covered, funerary uses I haven't said anything about, the private domestic context, again, how coats of arms are used on family homes, I haven't talked about that, the arms of local families, institutional arms belonging to either episcopal sees or urban councils and things like that. So there's a lot of work to be done. And whoever is keen on investigating further, it would be great to have more heraldic studies focused on this material. So I will stop here and await your suggestions or comments or questions, and stop sharing as well.